We're shining the spotlight on the best chess player ever, Bobby Fischer, with 6 scintillating games in his vicious version of the incredible Italian game. The first opponent is one of the strongest grandmasters of his time, Reuben, and Fischer starts e4 best by test. Black replies e5, and after white attacks the pawn with his knight, black defends it with his. Then Fischer plays bishop c4, the Italian game. With this move, white controls the center, attacks the vulnerable f7 pawn, and prepares to castle. Black plays copycat with bishop to c5, and white busts out b4, gambiting a pawn. With this move, white lures the black bishop away from the center as it captures the pawn, before he pushes c3 with the tempo in preparation of a central pawn break. The black bishop drops to a5, keeping an eye on the white king, and Fischer strikes in the center with d4. This looks crazy because black takes the pawn and white can't recapture due to the black bishop's pin. But white carries on by castling, and then he'll take the pawn on the next move. Unless black captures again, which he does, going up a full 3 pawns. On the other hand, white has an immense lead in development, virtually unopposed control over the center, and great attacking chances that start with queen b3, building a battery that threatens the f7 pawn. Black defends the pawn with queen to e7, and white wins back 1 pawn by developing his knight onto c3. Black's not in great shape here, and his best idea would be to exchange off some pieces. Instead, he develops his knight to f6, preparing to castle. But from this point forward, Fischer never gives black the chance. Knight e5 is the beginning with an attack on the black queen and knight. Black takes the piece and white recaptures with the pawn, hitting the other knight who jumps to e5. White takes the knight and black recaptures with the queen, who becomes a target for white's bishop as it develops to b2. The queen dodges to g5 and white keeps the threats coming with h4. This sacrifices a pawn, and black probably shouldn't take it, but he does, leaving the g7 pawn undefended. White takes the pawn with an attack on the rook, who sidesteps to g8. Fischer follows with rook f to e1 check, and while black could take the rook, it wouldn't really make much difference to the outcome of the game because white would just recapture with the other rook. So instead of this, the black king shifts over to d8, dodging check, and here white has a move that puts an end to the game on the spot. Can you find white's best possible move? To find the move, you need to notice that with the white rook cutting off the e-file, the black king sits on its only available safe square, and all white needs to do is give him a check. The bishop could do that, but for now, the black queen defends that square. So, the move Fischer plays to win the game is queen to g3, trying to deflect the black queen away from the defense of f6. Were the black queen to take white's queen, then bishop to f6 would be checkmate. To make things worse, the black queen is fully hanging and doesn't have a single safe square that still defends against the checkmate. Black's going to lose a decisive amount of material and probably the game shortly after. So, black decides at this point to resign the game. The next opponent is unknown and he meets the Italian game with knight f6. This blocks the black queen's defense of g5 however, so Fischer jumps his knight there, coordinating with his bishop on f7. Black blocks the attack with d5 and white takes the pawn, hitting the knight who jumps to d4. Black hits the knight again with c3, and white counters with b5, hitting the white bishop. White, wanting to keep it on the board, drops it all the way back to f1, and black ignores the attack on his knight, taking the pawn on d5, which opens the queen's counterattack on white's knight. White takes the knight on d4, removing the defense of the b5 pawn, and in return, black grabs the knight on g4. Fischer captures the now undefended b5 pawn while giving check. Even if black were to block, white would take the bishop, forcing the king to go uncastled. So instead of this, black just sidesteps his king right away, surrendering their castling privileges. White lifts his queen to f3, attacking the black knight, and black counters with e4. He probably should have taken the pawn instead, which would have opened his queen's defense of the knight, but by playing e4, white's queen can capture it, getting into an improved position in the center. Black proceeds by developing their bishop to d6, and after white castles, black places his other bishop on b7, where it not only peers the white queen, but indirectly coordinates with his queen onto g2. Fischer pushes his pawn to d3, opening an attack on black's queen. Black counters with knight f4, opening an attack on white's queen, and an attack by his queen on white's bishop. White takes the knight, hitting the queen, who swoops over to b5, taking white's bishop, while defending her own bishop, which was under attack. Then white plays d5 to block the attack on his queen, and black greedily snaps off the b2 pawn while hitting the rook in the corner. White takes the bishop on d6, and black can't take the rook just yet because white would get a checkmate in 2 with queen e7 and queen takes c7. Going back, so black doesn't take the rook, instead recapturing the bishop to stop the checkmate threat. Fischer cleverly continues rook to e1, and black still can't take the rook because if he did, then white would play queen to e7 check, pushing the king to c8 before checking again with rook to c1. Black could delay things, but the inevitable end would be king to b8 followed by queen c7 checkmate. Going back, now in this position, black definitely has the worst king safety among the two players, so his best bet would be queen to e5 trying to exchange queens. Instead of this, he plays queen to f6, defending against any queen e7 threats, but things begin to go from bad to worse for them. White develops his knight to c3, and black can't take the knight because of the queen to e7 and rook a to c1 idea. Going back, after white develops his knight to c3, black attacks the knight with rook to c8 instead. Fischer swings his queen over to b4, defending while pressuring black's bishop. Were he to take the bishop ever, black would always get the piece back. So black slides his rook over to e8, offering some more exchanges. But that's the last thing on Fischer's mind as he moves his queen to a5, giving a fatal check. It's either block with the rook, which would lose after white would take the rook on e8, forcing the king away from the other rook's defense, or the other option, and the one that black plays, is king to d7, which also loses, but I'll let you try to have a chance to figure out why. Can you find white's winning move? The black king is incredibly short on squares, and the black rook on the e-file is already under attack once by white's rook. Putting 2 and 2 together, the move Fischer plays to win the game is queen to a4 check, and black, seeing his ill fate, resigns the game. Black only has 4 legal moves here. 2 of them would be blocking the check with the piece, which would just lose the piece, so we can rule those out. One other option would be king to d8, which would cut off the black rook's connections, and white would win a full rook with check. Otherwise, the final choice for black would be king to c7. Technically, the absolute best follow-up move for white would be knight to b5 check, after which white could create a devastating attack on black's king. But the easiest way to win would be just by picking up the rook. Black would get the knight in return, but white would be up the exchange and the pawn, which would be more than enough for Fischer to win the game. The third opponent is the doctor, Januszkowski, and he meets the Italian with bishop to c5, to which Fischer again replies with the bold b4. Black takes the pawn before white attacks it with c3. It drops to a5 and white lunges in the center with d4. Black takes the pawn and white can't recapture due to the pin on his pawn. So he castles. Now this time black doesn't get greedy by taking a second pawn, instead playing d6 to open the development of his queenside bishop. White follows with queen to b3, doubling up on the f7 pawn, which black defends with queen to e7. Then white pushes e5, trying to weaken the diagonal aimed at black's queen. And black, who doesn't want to give white a fully open e-file while his king is still in the center, takes the pawn. Fischer's bishop swoops to a3, sniping the black queen, who, still needing to keep an eye on the fragile f7 pawn, dodges to f6. White takes the pawn on d4, attempting to open up the center, and black should take back, but he pushes his pawn to e4, trying to keep things closed. This allows white to use his new central pawn to jump his knight onto e5, adding a third attacker onto f7. Black could take the knight, but white would recapture with the pawn, hitting the queen, who would still need to keep an eye on f7. and things could get really dangerous after white's e6. Instead of this, black plays the more solid knight h6, defending the f7 pawn. White takes the other knight, and black still can't take with his queen, so he recaptures with the pawn, getting a shattered queenside pawn structure. Fischer moves his queen to a4, immediately targeting the weak pawn while hitting the black bishop, who drops to b6. Then white develops his final minor piece with knight to c3 with an attack on e4, and while black could defend it, he chooses to develop his final minor piece as well with bishop to d7, peering the enemy queen. White wins back one pawn with an attack on black's queen, who counterattacks on f4. The white knight jumps to c5, hitting black's bishop, so black takes the knight with his other bishop, and white recaptures with his. Black jumps his knight to f5, trying to reintegrate it into the game, before white gives check with rook f to e1, and the king sidesteps to its only available safe square on d8. Black's last move left defense of the f7 pawn, so Fischer grabs it, equalizing material. But you could say white has the advantage here with the black king's seriously suspicious situation. Black drops his knight to d6, hitting the bishop, who backs up to e6, offering an exchange. Now, he doesn't mind the capture because he would insert queen takes c6, hitting the rook, before recapturing the bishop. Going back, instead of this, black slides his rook over to e8, threatening to take the full bishop. Now, white has an idea here, and that would be to take the bishop, luring the king into a pin before playing d5 to pile up on the pinned pawn. But as is, he would lose his queen. Going back, to prepare his idea, white pushes g3 first to kick the queen off the rank. Fischer follows through with his crushing combination, starting with bishop takes d7. After the black king takes back, white pushes d5, threatening to take on c6 with what would be a devastating check. The black knight jumps to b5, opening his queen's defense of the pawn while blocking the white queen's attack. But white shifts his rook over a square, and the threat isn't to take on c6. No, it's to swing the queen over to g4, forcing the king back to d8, and then to take on c6 with a discovered check, and no good way for black to stop a checkmate on d7. Going back, so black drops his king to c8 instead, but Fischer keeps the difficult questions coming with queen to a6 check. The king going to b8 wouldn't be pretty after pawn takes c6, which would make a checkmate on the next move virtually unstoppable. So instead, the king clumsily carries himself back into the eyes of the white rook, and white takes the pawn on c6, giving check. The black knight blocks, and white takes the piece. Black recaptures with the pawn, and despite white only being up one pawn, white has a move here that completely wins the game. Can you find white's winning move? To find the move, you could notice that the black rook in the corner is undefended and that a white queen on d7 would be checkmate. Fischer notices these two things, and the move he plays is queen to b7. Black, with absolutely no way to stop both of these threats, resigns the game. And there really is no way to stop both. Black is going to have to pick the checkmate, and white would probably pick up the rook in the corner, but if he wanted to go for a quicker win, he could even play c7 check. The fourth opponent is Eric Osbun, and he meets the Italian game with bishop to c5. Fischer plays his Evans Gambit, and black's bishop is lured away from the center before it's attacked again with c3. It drops to a5, and white strikes with d4. Black takes the pawn, and white can't recapture because of the pin, so he castles. Black's d6 opens his queenside pieces, and white's queen jumps to b3, threatening the pawn on f7. Black defends with queen to d7, but locks in his own bishop, and white takes on d4, developing a dominant central pawn duo. Black drops his bishop to b6, adding an attacker to the pawn, so white plays bishop to b5, taking away one of those attackers. Now white's about to push d5, so black quickly gets his most valuable piece off of the diagonal. Fischer follows through with d5, but black is now able to counter with knight a5 hitting white's queen. With the black king moved, white isn't able to take black's queen with check. So white moves his queen, and black plays c6, blocking the attack on his queen. White takes, and after black recaptures, white drops his bishop to d3. Black's knight backs up to b2 to reroute towards the center, and white develops his knight to c3. Black's knight jumps to c5, hitting both the queen and the bishop, so the white queen drops to c2, defending. Now black has fended off white's attack for now, emerging up one pawn after the Evans gambit. But white still has a lead in development and a safer king. Still, there are no imminent threats for white, so black catches up in development with knight e7. Fischer brings out his final minor piece, attacking a heavily populated diagonal. Black's knight jumps to g6, looking to jump forward, and white slides his rook over a couple squares on the same line as the enemy queen. Black's knight carries on advancing with a punch on the bishop, who tucks itself away next to its king. Black gets his king out of the center, with the drawback of locking up his own rook in the corner, and white plays the clever knight e5, exploiting the pin on the d-pawn to attack the queen. Black's queen sidesteps over while getting out of the pin as well, so the white knight escapes danger onto c4. Black's pawn is under attack several times, and there isn't really a way to defend it, nor can black push the pawn forward. So black just develops his bishop. Fischer wins the second pawn back, equalizing material, and black swings his rook over to d8, attacking it. White fastens his knight into place with e5, and black undermines the knight with f6. This move looks good, except for one subtle flaw. The flaw that Fischer spots is the weakened diagonal towards black's king, and f6 also loosens the bishop. White starts by taking the knight on c5, loosening the bishop some more, and after black takes back, white jumps his knight from c to e4, attacking the bishop while defending his knight. Black takes white's dominant knight, and white recaptures with his pawn, getting awfully close to promotion, while hitting the queen as well, who drops to c8. Fischer's knight keeps going forward to c5 where it hits the bishop, and black can't allow a capture because of the potent pin that would follow along the diagonal. So, black moves his bishop to d5, and white pushes d7 a square away from glory. The black queen steps out of danger, and white kicks the black knight with g3. It drops to e6, trying to remove the defender of white's d-pawn. But white's fine with this, as he takes the knight, and after black recaptures, white moves his bishop to c4, taking full advantage of the delicate diagonal aimed at black's king. The reasons that white is so ahead in this position is that despite material being even, white has the dominant d-pawn, and to make things worse, black's rook in the corner isn't really playing. So in reality, white is just up a full rook. Just to illustrate, were black to take white's bishop, white would recapture with the queen, forcing the king over to f8. Then the white queen would jump to e6, where she can't be kicked, and black's hopes of ever getting his rook out would fade away. White would just start winning pawns before eventually trying to promote his own. Back to the game. For this reason, the black king advances to f7, defending his bishop. This opens up his rook, but after Fischer takes the bishop, black's king is lured deep into the center. White's rook shifts over with check, and the king tries to run. But he can't hide, because the queen checks on c4. If the king goes backwards, then he's just locking up his rook again, and white could eventually try to promote his pawn. Going back, so instead of this, the king goes forward. White's rook swoops into the 7th rank, cutting off the king's backwards escape, which threatens all sorts of dangerous queen checks. In response, black shifts his rook over so he can at least defend his g7 pawn. Fischer, in no hurry, activates his final piece with rook a to e1, and black plays h5, desperately trying to create a retreat for his king. The white queen finally jumps in with queen f7 check, and the king hides on h6. The other rook jumps in from 1 to e6, creating a threat that cannot be stopped. Black's rook moves over, attacking the white queen, and here's where white can play a move that concretely wins the game. Can you find white's best possible move? If you want to find this move, you're going to have to do some cold hard calculation. The g-pawn is pinned to the h7 square, but you need to figure out whether a queen on h7 would lead to checkmate. Fischer does this calculation, and the move he plays to win the game is rook takes f6 check. Now black has very few moves here. The king running to h7 or going to g5 would both end poorly. The other option could be blocking the check with g6, but black still needs to watch out for white's d-pawn. White would take the pawn with check, forcing the rook to recapture. This would leave defense of the other rook, and white would take it before promoting his pawn. Back to the game, so black settles for his only remaining option, taking the rook. Fischer's queen goes to h7, and the black king is forced to g5. h4 check comes next, and the king continues its forward march. Now white's absolute best possible move here would be king to g2, and black would have no good way of stopping f3 checkmate. Instead of this, Fischer plays rook to e4 check, and the king continues forward to h3. Queen f5 check comes next, and black's only move is blocking with the rook. White takes it, and it's pretty much game over. Now black doesn't have to take the rook back, but he has to worry about all sorts of dangerous discovered checks. His best possible move here would be queen e5, trying to exchange queens. But white would just accept the exchange, and black still has to worry about the d-pawn, while white's rook can continue winning some more pawns, emerging up 2 pawns in a completely winning endgame. Going all the way back, black isn't too happy with this, so he just takes the rook, keeping the material advantage of a full rook, and Fischer happily plays queen d3. Black resigns at this point because no matter what you do, there's no good way to stop queen f1 checkmate. The penultimate opponent is Grandmaster Arthur Bisguier, and he meets the Italian game with knight f6 attacking white's pawn. But this loosens up the g5 square, so Fischer's knight hops there, adding an attacker to f7. Black blocks the diagonal with d5, and after white takes it, black's knight hops to a5, hitting the bishop. White gives a check, and black hits right back with c6. White exchanges the pawns, and after black recaptures hitting the bishop again, he drops all the way back to e2. White just won a pawn here, but black gets a small lead in development after kicking the knight back to h3 and bringing his bishop out to c5. Both sides castle, and white plays d3, rushing to bring out his queenside pieces, before black takes the knight on h3. Fischer takes back, courageously opening the path towards his king. Black lifts his queen, attacking the weak h3 pawn, and after white puts his bishop on f3, where it dominates the important long diagonal, black wins back the pawn. White develops his knight to d2, defending his bishop who was under attack, and black centralizes a rook on d8. White's bishop backs up, becoming a shield for his king, while kicking the black queen back to f5. Then white shifts his queen over to the semi-open e-file, and black brings his rook over to the same file. White's knight hops to e4, hitting the bishop, who backs up a square. Fischer follows with a capture on f6, slimming down the black king's defenses, and once black takes back, white shifts his king over, getting out of the pin in preparation of an f4 pawn break. Black c5 opens a path for the knight on the rim to re-enter the game, and white's queen jumps to c3 so that after black reactivates his knight, white can play f4 with a tactic. That is, black shouldn't take the pawn because white would take the queen, removing the defender of the knight before winning the piece. Going back, instead of this, black jumps his knight to a powerful post on d4, and the white queen moves so that he can kick the knight right away, before black shifts his queen a square, putting pressure near white's king. Fischer pushes c6, attacking the knight. Now knight to c2 would be a really annoying move here, because after the rook would move, black would be able to take the pawn on f4. Instead of this, black jumps his knight to f5, giving white the time to take on e5. The rook recaptures and white's bishop develops with a punch, but black's rook jumps to the second rank with a checkmate threat on g2. The white bishop runs away, pinning the knight to the queen while keeping an eye on checkmate. Now black could put a lot of pressure on white here with a move like rook to e8, threatening to remove the defender of the checkmate. But he lets all of that pressure go with a greedy capture instead on b2. This gives white the opportunity to turn the tables in an instant. Can you find white's one and only winning move? Black's knight is in a pin and the white rook can almost see it. So all white has to do is move his bishop out of the way. Now, importantly, the white bishop cannot leave this diagonal because otherwise black would have a painful checkmating combination that sacrifices the knight to get at the white king before giving checkmate on h2. Going back, this leaves Fischer with one safe option, and the move he plays to win the game is bishop to e5. That's all she wrote. This knight cannot be defended as the black rook miserably shifts over a square, attacking white's bishop. White takes the knight with his rook to defend his bishop, going up a full piece, and after black hopelessly takes, white just takes back, keeping his decisive material advantage. So, black resigns. The final opponent is Oyarcel, and he meets the Italian game with bishop to c5. Fischer plays his tried and true b4, luring the bishop away from the center as it captures. This time after white attacks the bishop with c3, black runs it all the way back to e7. This gives white the freedom to push d4 without fear of losing a pawn, and black maintains the tension with d6. White takes the pawn, trying to open the position, which would favor him with his lead in development. Now black takes back with the knight, trying to exchange pieces, but white doesn't really mind as he captures the knight, opening his queen's diagonal towards h5. Black takes back, and the white queen jumps to h5, forking the f7 pawn with the help of his bishop, and the pawn on e5. You can't save both, and f7's probably the more important of the two, so black plays g6. Fischer regains his pawn with an attack on the rook in the corner. Black blocks by developing his knight, and white piles up on black's bishop that's pinned to the king with his own bishop on a3. Now that bishop's defended enough for now, so black moves his rook out of the pin, and after white castles, black is able to freely move his knight to g4, hitting the queen. White retreats her to g3, unpinning black's bishop, who snaps off white's on a3. White recaptures with the knight, and black attacks it with queen to e7. White counters with bishop to b5 check, cleverly meeting black's c6 with knight to c4. His plan is to play knight d6 were his bishop to be captured, and this would fork the king and the bishop so that after everything, the defense of the knight would be removed and he'd get the piece back. Back to the game, black doesn't take the bishop, instead moving his queen to e6 with an attack on the knight. And the bishop who's defending it has to move, so it seems like white's losing. But Fischer's rook dashes to d1. Black takes the bishop, and then the white queen jumps to c7, threatening a checkmate on d8. Black's in a pickle. Defending the checkmate with his queen would result in knight d6 check, and black would have to give up the queen for the knight since the king has nowhere to go. So instead of this, black develops his bishop to d7, blocking the rook's file. White's knight jumps to d6 anyway, but the king can hide itself behind his bishop. Fischer's knight keeps going with the brilliant knight f5 check. Black's toast. King to e8 would result in a royal fork, and the king marching forward to f6 would lead to rook d6 and a potent pin. So the black has no choice but to take the knight. White recaptures with the pawn, opening the essential e-file with an attack on black's queen, and black counters with rook to c8, hitting white's queen. At this point, black might be able to wiggle his way out of this mess since he's still up 2 full pieces, if it weren't for one and only one white move. Can you find white's only winning move? White has to strike, and he has to do it quick. Fischer does some calculation and plays his best possible forcing move, the remarkable rook takes d7 check. Black's queen is still under attack, so he has no choice but to accept the sacrifice. White follows with f6 check, trying to deflect the king away from the queen's defense. And rook e1 check is coming, which wouldn't be pretty either. Black takes the pawn with his knight, and with the king having nowhere to run, is forced to block the white rook's check with the knight. White takes the knight, finally pushing the king away from his queen, which white scoops up on the next move. Black's rook f to d8 is a last-ditch effort at catching white off his guard, but Fischer is no slouch, as he drops his queen to g4, defending against the back-rank checkmate. Black down a rook for a queen, resigns the game. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Use my link in the description to buy a chess.com membership, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.